Hello and welcome to Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments and business trends shaping the global economy. I'm Rob Moulton, a partner in Latham & Watkins' London office. In this episode, part of a 10-part series complementing our 10 key focus areas for UK regulated firms in 2024 report, we discuss enforcement action against firms. And to discuss this, I'm joined by my colleague from the London office, partner Andrea Monks. Andrea, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Rob. Delighted to be here.
I'm looking forward to it too. So I thought we would start with some people points. FCA has got new joint heads of enforcement. Any background as to what we know about them or their approach?
Sure. So let's start with who they are. So Therese Chambers and Steve Smart, quite different backgrounds. So Therese could almost be described as an FCA lifer, been there, I think, for close on a couple of decades. So sort of steeped in the FCA and how it does things. Steve Smart, slightly less so. He obviously comes from the NCA, and so his focus, we expect, will be on sort of data and technology and digital tools. I think a couple of other things we can look at. Interesting that there's a joint appointment that presumably is an indication of the sort of dual focus of the FCA in the enforcement space going forwards. And also the big point is they're not Mark Stewart. And I think Mark Stewart was pretty era defining in terms of how he took the wheel at the FCA from an enforcement perspective. A lot of people remember when he came on the scene, he sort of burst onto the scene with lots of commentary about what he was planning to do. And it was the sort of assertive, as some would say, aggressive stance to take when new in role. And frankly, he sort of followed through on that for a lot of his time there. So quite big shoes in some ways to fill, but also taking a very different approach, I think, is what we'll see going forward.
So Andrea, in the post-Stewart era, what are the key issues on each regulator's radar this year?
Well, I think there's a few. I mean, I think what we learned from the inaugural speech from Therese Chambers is the focus on conduct and culture that we've seen coming out of the FCA for some time isn't going away. She chose her inaugural speech to say that doing the right thing when no one is looking is very sharply in focus for her. And that hits all of those kind of culture and conduct, hot button issues that we have seen the FCA playing out sort of publicly for the last few years. And again, that's probably no surprise, given, as I said, she's an FCA lifer and steeped in the sort of issues that the FCA have been focused on for years. That is going to be a kind of consistent focus. What else are we going to see on the landscape this year? Again, playing to sort of Steve Smart's background, I think we will see, again, more sort of data-led investigations. So a couple of years ago, before Steve joined, the FCA announced plans to transform its data platform. It came out very loudly into the market, said it was building new tools, improving its data strategy, looking for ways of managing much more quickly and efficiently large and complex data sets to spot areas for investigations. So using that data as a diagnostic tool, and sort of consistent with that previously stated objective, bringing Steve in, I think we're going to see more of that kind of data-led, data-diagnosed investigations going forward.
And so the classic sort of maybe insider dealing or manipulation case where the transaction reports and the cross-market analysis is what's driving the regulators. Do you think that's where Steve is?
Exactly that. And, we've seen some market abuse, quite a few market abuse enforcement decisions that have come out over the last couple of years, but I don't think we've seen the last of them by any stretch. So I think that is where we will continue to see enforcement action. Financial crime obviously remains a focus. I think in previous years, we would have said the big trend is in sort of AML systems and controls and the like. This year, I'm not predicting that, unlike kind of prior years, because we have seen a lot of fines in that space. I think the FCA has met its statutory objectives by getting kind of out and proud with its findings in the kind of AML arena. I don't feel that they are done with market abuse, and because that sits squarely in the kind of data diagnostic monitoring capabilities space, I think we're likely to see more of that. Another point probably in focus for the FCA this year is they've had a pretty torrid time in the upper tribunal. Obviously, a lot of that has been in relation to cases against individuals, but it nonetheless has some bearing on cases against firms. And that is because what we are expecting to see is the FCA trying to use other weapons in its armoury to drive the results it wants to see against firms, whilst at the same time avoiding getting into the upper tribunal. So taking redress and remedies through other avenues in the interest of avoiding what has been a series of pretty public kickings by the upper tribunal recently.
So that's interesting, Andrea. So do you then expect the regulators to focus on a small number of hard cases to make sure they get the big headlines from them? Or do you think it will be opening a large number of enforcement cases of all firms and all types being at risk, and they'll see where they go?
So I think that's yes to hard cases and no to large numbers of enforcement cases. And let me take those sort of two in reverse order, if you will. So large numbers of enforcement cases, that was very much the sort of Mark Stewart drum that he banged repeatedly, which is that we should be opening more cases and closing more cases. We should be using enforcement as a way of sort of testing if there's something there, if there is sort of substance to issues, which would be a much more sort of aggressive approach to the use of the enforcement armoury. And I think we will see less of that going forward. And part of that is because, again, we've sort of seen and heard from Therese Chambers about an enthusiasm for closing down legacy investigations, for ensuring that enforcement is focused on the FCA's statutory objectives, aligned to their statutory objectives. And frankly, there is just less money around. And so consistent with sort of all of those things, I think we will see fewer cases. It won't just be let's open sort of multiple cases and have them all running and, expect to close a large number of them. On the hard cases point, yes, I think we will see a continued appetite for taking some hard cases. Now, that is not a new trend. A couple of years ago, the FCA board, in some well-publicised minutes, recorded that the FCA needed to recalibrate the degree of legal risk that it was willing to take. And they said, in those board minutes that the FCA was going to be prepared to take action where there was a lack of clarity or where there was a risk of imminent consumer harm. So it was quite a statement of intent that we saw at the time, with a view to sort of showing an appetite on the part of the FCA to take on hard cases. So the market was very attuned to looking for, were they going to follow through on that statement of intent? And I think they have done to some extent. So, for instance, later that year, we saw the Frensham case, certainly a hard case, not one that went well for the FCA, but one that they took on. And I think we have seen as practitioners in a number of our kind of non-public engagements with the FCA, we've seen the FCA take positions which, frankly, can only be described as pushing the envelope somewhat, being prepared to sort of stretch the boundaries of, where the law and regulation is currently at to try to drive home some FCA statutory objectives. So I think those hard cases are ones that are not going away.
And where do you think the PRA is on that spectrum of traditionally having brought less cases? Is it going to be taking more risk and bringing more cases?
I'm not sure we have enough to really gauge that. It's easier with the FCA because we get a bit more prolific in terms of what they say. They're certainly more prolific in terms of the number of enforcement cases that they bring. So I'm not sure that the PRA necessarily has any greater risk appetite for bringing difficult cases. Certainly what we're seeing from the PRA is an enthusiasm for when firms are in enforcement to try to close those cases sooner. I think, like with most regulators, the time it takes for investigations continues to be a challenge for both the PRA and the FCA. And they're also being called upon, as is everybody these days, to do more with less money. And what we're seeing with the PRA, of course, is their early account scheme, which has come online recently. And the objective, obviously, behind that is to encourage early settlement with an enhanced discount, so moving up from a 30% settlement discount to a 50% settlement discount for firms who are prepared to opt into that early account scheme and to enable the PRA to close investigations more quickly. So I think that's a sort of indicator on where the PRA is at, less about hard cases, but more about kind of procedurally trying to kind of clear cases more quickly.
That's really interesting, Andrea. I mean, I hope our listeners don't need to update themselves on 2024 enforcement against firms at a later point in the year, but I'm sure it's always better to know where these risks are so that they can understand how to prioritise their own resources.
I think that's right, Rob. I mean, let's hope our listeners don't find themselves in the firing line during 2024. The one additional point I would make about the PRA is, in addition to the early account scheme, what we have seen recently is a change to the way in which financial penalties are calculated. In particular, step 2 of the PRA's framework for imposing financial penalties has seen a change, a move away from using revenue potentially as an indicative starting point for where fines should be pitched, and instead into a sort of tiered approach based on the seriousness of the breach and the importance of the firm to the financial markets. Our pretty strong sense is that will take PRA fines in one direction only, which is upwards. And so we are anticipating a rise in the value of fines that we see coming out of the PRA. And so hopefully that doesn't affect our listeners, but it's one to watch out for.
Well, that's great, Andrea, and thank you for sharing those thoughts with us.
Thanks very much for having me, Rob. It's been great.
And thank you for listening to this episode in our Connected with Latham podcast series. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcasts on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like more information about the topics in this podcast, or to access our 10 key focus areas in 2024 report, please visit the links located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10020. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.